Rip City Mornings.
I'm joining us now to maybe try to make sense of it, talk about what could potentially happen in the future, how this is going to affect 2023, and just happy to talk some college football with senior college football writer Adam Rittenberg back on the big show. Good morning, Adam. How are you?
Oh, good morning. Doing great. Hope you're doing well.
It's a weird time out here. I'll be perfectly honest, Adam. It's been a weird 6 days. You and I think, are roughly the same age, and so I don't know if you like this as much as I do, but I like explaining to my young millennial producer that this thing that is happening is nothing new, that these things have happened in the past, and that we got past certain things before. But going back to last Friday, maybe most significant day we've seen in college football in the last, 30, 40 years?
Well, in terms of the program's impact, it absolutely, in the conference that has a lot of history in the Pac-12, you just don't see so many teams moving on the same day with such catastrophic consequences. And so I think that day will certainly be looked at. But again, it was the days leading up to that day. It was the weeks leading up to that day. It was the years leading up to that day. That really, again, it's certainly jarring, especially for somebody, who grew up on Pac-10 football in the Bay Area like me. But, you can't really be surprised because that was always a possibility. I mean, we've talked about it on the show over the last year that this could happen, but it's still shocking when it does happen.
So I've asked multiple guests, and we've had multiple conversations, and there's no perfect answer. But for the Pac, you mentioned it growing up. I did the same thing, whether Pac-10, Pac-12, whatever it was. How did it get so bad? Where I know the Larry Scott failures. I know maybe the response with COVID. I think there's also the whole Kliavkoff and the alliance thing. But Adam, how did it get to a point where this conference with 100+ years of tradition and solid fan bases and solid schools could not get a deal on regular TV? How did it get this bad?
Yeah, it's a complicated question because it, again, does go back a ways. But I think that, you look at some of the leadership decisions that were made or not made over the last few years, and collectively, I think that's how it got this bad. And I keep the phrase that keeps coming to mind is, just take the deal. We've all heard that in our lives sometimes. You watch like Law and Order or those types of shows where lawyers are talking like, just take the deal. And there were a few moments where the Pac-12 just could have taken the deal, whether it was going through with an expansion under Larry Scott that got sidetracked. Obviously, a couple of years ago when the Big 12 was weakened, going through an expansion. Even last year, could the Pac-12 have added schools to solidify itself in case of the worst? And they didn't do that. I think there were other instances where they had opportunities to add schools individually, but maybe had a moral obligation against BYU, or it was elitism about Texas Tech or whatever. Like those moments collectively, and it all goes back to leadership. Lead a league back to where it is right now.
Well, and I guess you kind of hinted at it there. That's the other part of this that I don't quite understand, which is, if the Big Ten wanted 4 Pac-12 schools, if the Big 12 wanted 4 Pac-12 schools, and I know that the ACC thing has kind of hit some roadblocks, but it looks as though at least Stanford is going to be coveted, and they may have a dance partner in Cal. If it looks as though 10 schools in the Pac-12, somebody wanted to put those schools on TV. It's amazing that they could not figure out how to get a deal done collectively. I think it probably goes back to leadership, like you said. But, I mean, if 10 schools are all still being coveted by bigger conferences and TV networks, it's amazing they couldn't get a deal done.
Right, or at least present options to their presidents that would make them more at ease than what would ultimately happen, because that's come out in some of the presidential statements over the last week or so, that it was essentially one deal. It wasn't multiple deals. It wasn't deals with linear partners. It was this gamble. And I think there's still a lot of scar tissue based on what happened the last time the Pac-12 took a gamble with the Pac-12 networks under Larry Scott. And so even though not all of those presidents were in their roles at the time, they're certainly educated on what happened the last time around and how damaging it was for the Pac-12 in relation to the other conferences. Because again, 11 years ago, we were all celebrating the Pac-12 and its media rights deal with ESPN and Larry Scott and innovation, and they're ahead of the game. But then there were such an unfortunate series of missteps that we've just talked about, and some that we haven't talked about. But ultimately, the fact that you couldn't have multiple deals presented, or it seems like multiple deals couldn't get to the finish line before they could be presented to the presidents, ultimately led to a situation where Washington and Oregon in particular were looking for a more stable situation, and they found it in the Big Ten.
Adam Rittenberg, senior college football writer for ESPN, joining us here on 620 Rip City Radio. As we went to bed last night, it looked like maybe there was potential for Cal and Stanford to be joining the ACC. That seems to have hit some roadblocks overnight. The four remaining schools, and again, this is the most unfair of questions, Adam, but of the four remaining schools, what do you think is the most likely outcome? Do they stick together? Is this every team for themselves? Of the four schools left in the Pac-12, what's the most likely outcome?
Well, again, I think it'll be interesting to see. I don't sense that the ACC push to add Stanford and Cal is dead. I think it could still happen because there's support within that league from high up on down for those schools. Now there's not enough support, and we'll see if that can change here in the next few days. But if that door is closed, it will be very interesting because if those two schools leave, then I think you're looking at the Mountain West for Oregon State and Washington State. I mean that just unfortunately makes the most sense for them. From a regional standpoint, having to adjust to the budgetary challenges of going from making $30 million or $20 million, whatever it is, a year to a lot less from your media rights deal. So I think that's the likely possibility. Now, if they do have four, what can you do? I think you can do a little bit more as far as some type of merger, some type of expansion, additions. But I think we still have to see if the ACC door is closed, because if it's open, Stanford and Cal are going to jump at that opportunity given their current situation.
All right, let's go into a hypothetical where maybe that door is closed, where the ACC is like, we don't want to go on West Coast flights 4 times in football and 9 to 10 times in basketball and the rest of the stuff. If that is closed and you can somehow keep the remaining 4 schools together, and this is where I think it gets complicated, Adam, because I don't know enough about it. It's easy to just go on Twitter and be like, merge with the Mountain West. Well, is it the Mountain West adding 4 schools? Is it the Pac-12, which still has infrastructure because they're playing football in 2023, essentially backfilling for the 8 schools that left? How would that even begin to work?
Yeah, I mean, I think that mergers have been discussed a lot over the last few years, and certain partnerships have been discussed, including the alliance, which we all joke about now, and they're hard to pull off. They just are, and so again, it will be interesting to see how it works, especially I was doing a radio show a couple of days ago. We had a guy from the Union Tribune in San Diego on, Mark Ziegler, and his story about it was talking about which Mountain West schools will be left out in that case. So it all trickles down. Are you doing a full-on merger? Are you doing a partial merger? Are you doing a expansion grab and a reshaping? I mean, I think your point earlier is valid that these Pac-12 schools were essentially at the table with an interesting offer from Apple. You can make fun of it if you want, but the reality is that type of offer might be much more common the next time these media rights deals come around. I mean, the one thing that needs to be brought up is unless there's a true NFL-style super league in college football where essentially the broadcast partners are going to pick who's in the league, that's what it'll be, right? If it's not that, I don't know if this money train is going to keep going up and up and up for these conferences. I don't know if the SEC's next deal or the Big Ten's next deal or even the Big 12's next deal is going to be as exciting as people kind of think it is right now. So that's another thing to keep in mind is that, if the Pac-12 can pull something together, they're obviously not going to get the same amount of money they were promised with 10 teams. But if they can pull something together in a similar format, that ultimately may be the type of deal that these leagues are getting in the future. Again, it's a gamble, but these are certainly desperate times, especially for those 4 remaining schools.
Adam Rittenberg, senior college football writer for ESPN, joining us here on 620 Rip City Radio. Let's move forward and into 2024 and essentially figure out where those 4 schools left in the Pac-12, they end up finding a home and we start playing football in 2024, which is actually going to happen. How much of a calm? How long do we have where maybe this whole thing happens again, Adam? I mean, are we looking at maybe, is there like going to be a 5-year lull? Is this going to be maybe a 1 to 2 year every summer kind of pops up where maybe this school isn't quite happy or this, I mean, the Florida State Clemson thing is fascinating. Like, is this going to be something just every summer, like NFL free agency where schools are just going to be maybe trying to jump from conference to conference?
Yeah, there's certainly been a pattern, right? We're in this very dynamic, chaotic time right now. And, I was thinking, well, maybe it'll get to a resolution and there'll be, 40 teams that are in the Super League or the Super Division, and that's it. But then there's going to be teams that are going to try to get into that division. What do we have to do to get in? Tell us what we have to do. So there's so much jockeying because the money is what it is. And, so many, I don't know if you've read some of the reports out about SMU, which is, again, a small private school in north of Dallas downtown that has some history in football, but they also have these incredibly rich boosters that are saying, we'll come to the Pac-12 or the ACC for free. We would have come to the Pac-12 for free. Like there's just, it's so ego driven. This is what's so different about college sports versus pro sports is that you have these emotional investors that are kind of willing to do anything to keep their team at a certain level, even if they don't belong at a certain level. There's so many teams that objectively in college football should not be playing at the same level. You hear stories about budgets and travel and staffing at certain schools, and you're like, what? Kent State's playing Georgia? Like, what are we doing here? Like, but this is what the enterprise that we're in. And so I think it would be fascinating. I do think we're going to have some type of clear cutoff and saying these are the teams that are in and these are the teams that are out. But I don't know if that will settle it down either, because the teams that are out are clearly going to want to get in.
One of the other things we've kind of kicked around on here, I think there's a lot of old college football mindset of these are the teams that are significant power conference teams versus group of 5 teams. But there is going to be a 12-team playoff. There is going to be more seats at the table. And I've brought up this question, Adam, about is there room for a Gonzaga of college football, especially with regards to maybe Washington State and Oregon State? Is there room for a team that maybe doesn't play in the strongest conference, but they schedule well out of conference and they can get into a 12-team playoff? I know 64 field is much easier to get in than 12, but do you think, is there maybe a spot now moving forward with the 12-team playoff that there is kind of maybe a mid-major tier that's kind of created?
Well, again, I do believe that whatever format they adjust for, given the recent realignment for the CFP, is going to have a spot and maybe multiple spots for teams of that category, the Gonzaga of the college football ranks type teams. I just don't know if any of the remaining teams have what it takes to be Gonzaga. I mean, Boise State has been the closest thing, right? Boise State has been a relevant program for quite some time, but they are not what they were under Chris Peterson in terms of, national rankings, and are they going to get into the BCS? Remember that, like all of that conversation has kind of gone away, and, their revenue gaps are going to be even wider now. But they're an established program. They're in a market. Everybody knows who they are. They know about the blue turf. So it's got to be something like that. I think what would be fascinating is if Oregon State or Washington State have to rebrand themselves in that mold, are they able to turn into what Boise State was, or what Cincinnati or Houston or some of these other teams have become? Because they do have some things that have worked against them, especially from a geographical standpoint. So I think that'll be interesting to see. But in terms of having the opportunity, and that was one of the reasons for the larger playoff field going to 12, is to create some room for a team like that, or maybe multiple teams like that.
Orange turf in Corvallis is going to be wild. They have to do that rebrand, start putting in the orange turf. Adam Rittenberg from ESPN joining us on 620 Rip City Radio. One last thing before we let you go, Adam, and I know it's been probably a crazy week for you, and I really appreciate your time. The Netflix Johnny Manziel documentary was out. I don't know if you've seen it. But obviously, you've been in college football long enough. You lived the Johnny football experiment. We all kind of lived through it about 10, 11 years ago. And the conversation we have had is going back and kind of looking at it, and that was still in a social media time. Do you think that could ever happen again? Do you think that there could be another bad boy of college football? Could that ever happen again?
Well, absolutely. I think even now more so because of NIL. I mean, imagine what Johnny could have done from an NIL standpoint during that 2012 season, or even when he came back in 2013. I haven't seen the doc. I'm going to hopefully see it here soon, but I think it's certainly possible. We've had these figures over the course of college football history. Brian Bosworth is certainly one from way back. Johnny Manziel. There have been some others who have that sort of edgy brand, but now you're seeing so much encouraging of athletes to build their brands and to create markets for themselves financially, outside of just their scholarship and playing college football. So yeah, absolutely, there's room for it. But will somebody be kind of live that life in a season like that in that type of setting? That's hard to replicate every single thing that happened in the 2012 season with a certain personality. But I think there could be similar stories that we see here, especially because of the changes to the experience that these athletes are having, especially the high-profile ones.
Adam Rittenberg, senior college football writer for ESPN. You can follow him on Twitter at ESPN Rittenberg. Adam, thank you so much for the time. I really appreciate it. Have a terrific rest of the week. Have a great weekend. We'll talk to you soon.
You too. Thanks.